In the dry desert of El Centro, where illusion and reality blur together, an unnamed girl was born, carrying a voice powerful enough to challenge the world. No one knew that from nights of poverty, she was quietly learning to turn loneliness into music. Every drop of sweat on tiny stages, every dismissive glance, became the notes that fed a dream called Cher. From a child wandering with nothing but an old radio to an eternal pop icon, her journey was never just about fame. It was about the strength of someone who dared to belong to no one. It is the story of a voice born from dust, fueled by faith, and transformed into legend. A journey not about finding the light, but about becoming the light. The nameless girl of El Centro. El Centro, a small town carved into the blistering desert of Southern California, was the kind of place where heat could melt more than asphalt. It could melt dreams. In 1946, when Sherilyn Sarkisian was born, no one could have imagined that the dark-haired, deep-eyed baby would one day stand beneath the lights of the world's biggest stages. Her mother, Georgia Holt, was an amateur singer, clutching a dream she never quite caught. Her father, John Sarkisian, an Armenian-American truck driver, was a restless drifter who never stayed long enough to unpack his soul. They met in a spark of youthful impulse and parted in another. When Cher was not yet 2, her parents separated. She grew up among the passing men in her mother's life. Men with tired eyes and promises that dissolved in the air before morning. Cher's early years were a blur of movement, one dusty town to another, one cramped apartment to the next. Always short on money, always halfway to somewhere else. Georgia chased the Hollywood illusion, singing in smoky bars and taking forgettable bit parts on low-budget sets, while her little girl watched from the wings, learning how to smile through disappointment. Cher never understood why her mother's eyes shimmered behind the makeup. Maybe that was when she learned that the stage lights could bless and curse in the same breath. She never really had friends. Each move meant leaving behind a school, a tree, a familiar face. "I was always the new kid," she would later say, tall for her age. With a husky, ungirlish voice, she stood out in ways children don't forgive. The other kids called her weird, yet that sense of not belonging planted something defiant inside her, the quiet certainty that she didn't need to belong anywhere at all. On hot summer nights, while her mother worked late, Cher would sit on the porch of their cheap rental, staring at the desert sky freckled with falling stars. Crickets beat their steady rhythm like a distant drumline. She imagined herself somewhere else, New York, maybe Paris, or anywhere with a real stage. She sang along to the radio in a trembling whisper, her young voice raw but full of longing. That was the first time she understood that music needed no address, no permission. It was a home that moved with her, but dreams couldn't keep the lights on. Some nights they came up short on rent. Dinner was cereal in watered-down milk. Georgia tried to appear strong, though her hands shook, counting the last of the coins. She didn't have to say a word. Cher felt the weight of it. She learned early to observe quietly, a habit that later became her greatest tool as an artist. To watch, to remember, and to turn pain into melody. Sometimes her father appeared, a shadow smelling of gasoline and cigarettes. He would lift her up, promise adventures. Next time. That next time never came. Each time he left, her mother cried. Cher learned to hold back her tears by staring into the distance. Maybe that's why she grew up believing that leaning on anyone was temporary, that only she could save herself. By 8, Cher knew every note of Judy Garland and Ella Fitzgerald by heart. She mimicked their phrasing, not just to sing, but to understand what it meant to stand before the world and tell your own story. With no piano to guide her, she carried the orchestra in her head. Each song became a door out of the small room she lived in. Inside that imagined world, she wasn't the kid who'd changed schools 10 times. She was already under the spotlight. In 1952, when Georgia married musician John Southall, life briefly brightened. For the first time, there was real music in the house. A guitar's hum filling the silence. Cher sat beside him, learning the language of chords, the difference between major and minor. But like all her childhood chapters, this one ended too soon. Another divorce, another suitcase, another lesson in impermanence. Only now, she packed with eyes older than her years. From those broken fragments, Cher stitched together a strange belief. Every loss was one step closer to freedom. When you've got nothing left to lose, you can sing without fear. That fragile, stubborn faith would follow her into every stage she ever set foot on. Proof that even in a vast, indifferent world, there's room for one voice that refuses to sound like anyone else. El Centro never really left her. It lived in the grain of her voice, in the challenge in her stare. There was desert wind in her tone, road dust in her soul, and the echo of a little girl watching from the dark as her mother sang. Somewhere deep inside, a silent promise endured that one day the whole world would hear her. Dancing between the shadows, Cher's teenage years unfolded like a musical with no audience, a one-woman show in which she was both the lead actress and the writer of her own uncertain script. At 13, when most girls were dreaming about prom nights and pretty dresses, Cher was already questioning everything: family, God, and all the right rules adults swore by. She felt an invisible distance between herself and the rest of the world, not just because of poverty, but because of a quiet, nameless emptiness that lived inside her. Her small high school in Fresno was ordinary in every sense, yet to Cher, it became the first place she understood what it meant to belong nowhere. Her classmates called her strange. Her husky, low-pitched voice made people think she was pretending to sound cool. In truth, it was natural, a tone she'd had since childhood, sometimes mistaken by teachers for a sore throat. But Cher didn't care. She started wearing old jeans, baggy jackets, and a beret, a look unheard of in California, 1958. She wanted to stand out, yet dreaded the attention. That contradiction, the push and pull between rebellion and yearning, would later define her power on stage. Bold and defiant, yet silently asking to be understood, she found her escape in neighborhood dance classes, where young girls practiced mambo and cha-cha-cha under buzzing neon lights. The moment the music started, Cher transformed. The shy girl disappeared. In her place was someone free, electric, alive. Her body spoke a language words never could. The drum beat became her pulse, the saxophone her breath. She didn't know how or when, only that she was meant to live beneath the lights. At home, tension thickened the air. Georgia, still chasing her fading dream of acting, was exhausted by disappointment. The nights were long, filled with arguments about money, the future, and Cher's growing defiance toward school. Georgia wanted her to be practical, to finish her studies and find stability. But Cher wanted more, to sing, to dance, to feel something that made life mean something. "I'm going to be famous," she told her mother one night. Georgia only sighed. "Honey, fame doesn't pay the rent." But that line lit a fire in Cher, not of anger, but of determination. She would prove her mother wrong. One day, sitting alone in her room, she heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drift through the radio. The voice hit her like lightning, rough, raw, and full of instinct. It wasn't like any woman's voice she'd heard before. In that instant, she realized art didn't need to be sweet or perfect. It could be jagged, broken, painfully real. From that day, she sang differently. No imitation, no polish. Just the smoky, fierce sound of a girl with fire in her throat. Every note felt like freedom. At 15, Cher decided school wasn't for her. She dropped out, ignoring Georgia's desperate protests. "What will you even do out there?" her mother demanded. "I'll find out," Cher said simply. She had no plan, only a blurry conviction that the world had space for dreamers who refused to sit still. She got a job at a local movie theater, sweeping floors, tearing tickets, stealing moments behind the door to watch Audrey Hepburn or Marilyn Monroe glow across the silver screen. She didn't want to be them. She wanted to be seen, remembered, like they were. At night, she'd take her battered radio down to the riverbank. Sometimes the wind blew so hard she had to hold the antenna steady to keep the music alive. Closing her eyes, she let the sound merge with her heartbeat, imagining thousands of unseen listeners hearing her sing in the darkness. She smiled, not because she was happy, but because she knew she'd chosen a road with no return. As she grew older, she understood that music wasn't just joy. It was survival. When you have no one to talk to, you sing. When the world goes silent, you find melody. Cher didn't yet know how to write songs, but she'd already learned how to turn emotion into sound, as if every note were a drop of blood hitting paper one evening in 1961. As the desert sunset burned red across the sky, Cher stood before a mirror and stared at her reflection. In her eyes, she saw something she couldn't yet define. Fragile yet unyielding. "I'm leaving this place," she whispered. "Soon." And she knew it was true. She just didn't know how. The next morning, she packed a few clothes into an old canvas bag and hid it beneath her bed. A week later, when Georgia found the note, Cher was already gone, headed toward Los Angeles, the city she imagined written in neon and humming with music all night long. She had no money, no friends, no map, just the unshakable belief that if she kept moving, something would open. She couldn't have known that this reckless journey would mark the first step toward legend. But at that moment, Cher wasn't chasing fame or fortune, only running from invisibility. So she walked on into the dark, her footsteps beating time to a melody only she could hear, the rhythm of a dream just beginning to take form. City of Shattered Dreams, Los Angeles in 1962 was a maze of light and shadow, a city that lured the young and restless with pockets empty, hearts full, and heads clouded by illusion. It promised everything: fame, music, immortality. But few ever realized that behind the neon glow were millions of lost souls, surviving in damp, rented rooms and watching their dreams slowly decay. Into that glittering mirage stepped 16-year-old Cher. She arrived on a night bus, stepping off at Union Station just as dawn crept over the skyline. The little money in her pocket would last her only a few days. The air smelled of gasoline and cheap coffee, a mix that made her both thrilled and terrified. The city was overwhelming, skyscrapers flashing, signs buzzing, people rushing as if life itself were a race. She felt small, anonymous, yet for the first time in the right place. Here difference wasn't a sin. It was survival. Cher found a room on Hollywood Boulevard, peeling walls, a bed that groaned with every turn. Her neighbors were extras, waitresses, dancers, and other dreamers. They all spoke the same language: hope. At night, they gathered on the porch, smoking, sharing cups of instant noodles, watching the city glitter below the hills. They traded stories about auditions, a friend at Capitol Records, or a director who promised to call. Cher mostly listened. She understood that in this city, words meant little. Only persistence and luck mattered. Job hunting was brutal. With no diploma, no references, and a face too young for the roles she wanted, rejection became routine. Finally, a small diner took her in for the night shift. The pay was low, the hours long, and her feet throbbed after each shift. But whenever the kitchen radio played Elvis, Ray Charles, or Connie Francis, Cher smiled to herself. One day, she thought, they'll be playing my song. By day, she wandered along Sunset Boulevard, studying the posters of singers plastered across the walls. Sometimes she slipped into small recording studios where session musicians waited for work, quietly watching from a corner. Once she volunteered to clean a studio just to hear the sound of a real guitar echoing in her ears. When someone needed a background vocalist, she offered. Her deep, smoky voice turned heads. It was unlike the delicate tones most producers wanted from women, but no one was ready to take a chance on a nameless girl. "Keep practicing, kid," they'd say, half kind, half dismissive. A door cracked open just enough to remind her it was still closed. Still, Cher refused to quit. Every night after work, she returned to her tiny room, turned on the dim yellow lamp, and practiced. She placed a small mirror in front of her and sang to her reflection. At first, it felt strange, like looking at someone else, but gradually, she grew used to that image. A skinny girl with long black hair and eyes full of hunger, singing her heart out into the silence. "How long will I stay here?" she wondered. Then she answered herself, "Until someone sees me." The city was not kind to dreamers. Cher learned that fast. She watched roommates leave, some back to their hometowns, some down darker paths. There were nights when she nearly gave up too, sitting on the rooftop, staring at the sea of lights below. The wind howled between the buildings, and loneliness pressed hard against her ribs. Yet inside that loneliness burned a stubborn ember, the same one that had carried her from El Centro to here. She knew if she went home, she'd die in silence. Staying meant pain, but also possibility. Then fate arrived dressed in something ordinary. One afternoon, while waiting tables, a group of musicians came in for lunch. Loud, laughing, arguing about needing a backup singer for an upcoming session. Cher, heart-pounding, walked over and said, "I can sing." They burst out laughing, assuming she was joking. But one man, curly-haired, kind-eyed, said, "Let's hear her." Out in the parking lot, he handed her a guitar and strummed a slow blues riff Cher sang. She didn't tremble. When she finished, there was silence for a beat. Then a quiet smile from the man. "You've got something," he said. His name was Sonny Bono. That night, Cher couldn't sleep, not from excitement, but from fear. Fear that this would be another illusion in a city built on them, another promise vanishing like smoke. But deep down, she felt it. Something had shifted. For the first time, someone really saw her. Not as a waitress, not as a dropout, but as a voice with a soul. In the days that followed, Sonny invited her to the studio, guiding her through the basics. He was older, disciplined, trained in the business from his work with Phil Spector. Cher was raw, instinctive, wild. Together, they made an unlikely harmony. His warmth grounded her intensity. Her fire gave life to his structure. When they sang, something electric happened. Two mismatched sounds fusing into one that felt brand new. Sonny said, "One day, we're going to make it big." Cher didn't answer. She just smiled, her eyes bright with that same belief she'd carried all the way from the desert. And in her small room overlooking the endless hum of the city, Cher sang softly to herself, "I got you, babe." She didn't know that in just a few years, the whole world would be singing along. All she knew was that in this city of shattered dreams, she had finally found one worth holding on to. Meeting Sonny, the lamp in the smoke. Sonny Bono didn't crash into Cher's life like a bolt of lightning. He appeared like a small oil lamp flickering in a dark room, slow, gentle, but changing the color of everything it touched. When Cher met Sonny in 1962, she was 16. He was 30, seasoned, streetwise, already familiar with the music world's glitter and grime. He wasn't movie star handsome, short, curly-haired, with a gravelly voice and a half-smile that hinted at both humor and sadness. But he had something Cher had never seen before, an unshakable belief that dreams could be real if you worked for them relentlessly. To a girl raised on broken promises, that kind of faith felt like a miracle. At first, their connection was strictly professional. Sunny helped Cher record background vocals at Phil Spector's studio. She sang, he guided, showing her how to control her breath, emphasize emotion, and keep her husky tone from being swallowed by the instruments. Cher learned fast, with a quiet discipline that surprised everyone. After the session, Sunny invited her to dinner. They talked for hours about music, loneliness, and the strange conviction they both shared that if someone sang honestly enough, the world would have to listen. "You'll be famous," Sunny told her, "but not the kind of fame that explodes overnight. You'll climb, one rung at a time, until no one can pull you down." Cher smiled, but the words sank deep, a spark she would carry for years. Sunny became her mentor, her friend, and, slowly, her anchor. He introduced her to industry people, found her small gigs as a background singer, and sometimes let her crash on his couch when she couldn't pay rent. "Don't think about anything," he told her once. "Just protect that voice. The rest will come." Cher believed him, not because he promised much, but because he kept his promises. Los Angeles at that time was a haze of cigarette smoke, bitter coffee, and endless recording sessions that bled into dawn. Sunny and Cher spent hours in cramped studios, testing melodies, reworking harmonies, arguing, laughing, starting over. She wanted to sing raw, from the gut. He insisted on structure, on rhythm, on polish. But when the red light flicked on and the tape started rolling, their differences melted away. Their voices, his warm, hers deep, fit together like two pieces of a song that had been waiting to meet. Slowly, they became us. No declarations, no confessions, just long nights side by side, mornings with cheap toast and half-shared coffee, and the unspoken knowledge that in a cruel city, being understood by even one person was enough. Cher loved Sunny the way 16-year-old girls love for the first time. Fiercely, innocently, with blind faith. She didn't see the age gap, the imbalance of power, or the shadows that came with dependence. She saw only the man who made her feel safe. He taught her how to read contracts, how to spot false promises, but also, without meaning to, he became her keeper. Sunny chose her songs, her clothes, even how she should speak during interviews. At first, Cher mistook control for care. Only years later would she recognize how love can quietly tighten its grip until freedom feels like betrayal. They began performing in small bars under the name Caesar and Cleo. The crowds were small, mostly friends, curious passers-by, and fellow dreamers, but they didn't care. Cher learned how to hold the microphone, how to look an audience in the eyes without flinching. She wore long dresses, her dark hair loose, her voice unlike any other on the radio, low, rich, and haunting. People started to remember her face, even if they didn't yet know her name. Sunny stood beside her, guitar in hand, smiling that quiet smile. Some nights they were paid in food instead of cash. Still, Cher would say, "I'm happy. We're getting closer." Sunny would nod. Closer, but not close enough. Their love grew alongside their struggle, a partnership fueled by hunger and hope. They moved in together, sharing everything, bills, meals, and sleepless ambition. Cher cooked and cleaned. Sunny wrote songs and made phone calls, chasing opportunities. She began to realize she didn't just love him. She needed him without Sunny. She feared she'd slip back into the darkness she'd escaped. Their love was both a flame and a chain. Then one February night in 1964, in Sunny's cluttered little studio, he strummed a few chords and sang, "They say we're young and we don't know." Cher laughed, her raspy voice teasing, "Sounds like you're talking about us." Sunny grinned. "That's because I am." She joined in without thinking. What began as a joke became the seed of "I Got You Babe," the song that would one day change everything. But back then, they were just two broke souls in a smoky room, believing that music could rewrite their fate. Cher didn't know that the same man who would lift her to stardom would one day break her heart, that love and fame would twist together until they were impossible to separate. All she knew was that, in that dim room, Sonny looked at her and said softly, "You're going to be a star, not because of me, because of you. I just want to be there when it happens." Cher didn't answer. She just rested her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Then let's walk through the dark together." The beginning of her own voice. In 1964, as the British invasion crashed across America, with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who flooding the airwaves, young American singers were being swept aside. But in a small studio tucked away in West Hollywood, an 18-year-old Armenian-American girl was quietly fighting to make the world listen to her voice. Cher was no longer the lost girl from El Centro or the diner waitress clinging to a handful of broken dreams. She had survived hunger, silence, and nights of doubt. Now, her voice, smoky, low, tender, yet sharp as steel, was ready to become her weapon. Sonny called her the voice that doesn't sound like a girl. To him, it was a compliment. To her, it was identity. In a time when female singers were expected to sound pure, light, and obedient, Cher stood on the opposite end. Bold, grounded, unapologetically real. In the studio, she ignored conventional direction, singing by instinct. Sometimes she missed a beat. Sometimes she held a note too long. But when she listened back, she knew. That was her truth. "I can't pretend to be gentle," she once said. "I don't know how to sing softly when there's a storm inside me." Sonny saw what they could become. Not just lovers, but a duo, a brand, a story. He changed their names, Sonny and Cher. Together, they toured California, performing everywhere from dim bars to small town halls. Audiences didn't know what to make of them at first. The short, mustached man beside a tall, dark-haired girl dressed like a dream out of the hippie future. But people remembered them. When Cher sang "Baby Don't Go," something shifted in the air, a blend of grit and vulnerability that made listeners lean closer. That was the moment Cher began speaking to the world in her own language. Yet the journey wasn't just about music. It was a struggle between light and shadow within her. As fame flickered into view, the name Sonny and Cher spread fast. But most people assumed Sonny was the brain, and Cher was just the voice. In interviews, Sonny did the talking, while Cher smiled politely. On stage, they were equals. Off stage, she felt the pull between gratitude and the hunger for independence. She loved him, but she was beginning to understand that love alone couldn't define her. When she heard the applause, it echoed for both of them. But in her chest, her heart was learning a different rhythm. One night in 1965, they recorded "I Got You Babe." It wasn't meant to be revolutionary, just a simple song about two young lovers believing in each other against the odds. But when their voices met on tape, his warm, hers dusky and raw, it was alchemy. Phil Spector, once skeptical of her, sat silent after the take and finally said, "That girl, she's got something no one else can copy." A few months later, the song hit #1 on the Billboard charts, echoing across every radio in America. When Cher heard her own voice on the airwaves, she cried, not out of joy, but fear. What if becoming the dream meant losing herself? But that fear became her fuel. Cher began to realize that fame wasn't freedom, not unless she owned her voice. She started writing, experimenting, questioning about sound, love, image, everything. Sonny still managed the details, but Cher was no longer the quiet girl in his shadow. When reporters asked, "Who designed your outfit?" she raised her chin. "I did." When they said, "You should cut your hair. Short's the trend," she smiled. "I don't follow trends. I am the trend." From there, Cher's image evolved into something bigger than pop. A declaration. She became the woman who didn't ask for permission to be different. She sang not only for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been told to be smaller, softer, quieter, to be loved. Her voice, husky, imperfect, defiant, whispered to them all, "You don't need approval to exist." Each time she stepped on stage, the lights caught her long black hair and a current shot through her body. The fear that had haunted her since childhood, the fear of not being enough, of being unseen, was gone. Now she was the light. In those moments, she wasn't the girl who had slept on couches or sung to no one. She was whole, radiant, alive, and unafraid. When I Got You, Babe aired on The Ed Sullivan Show, America witnessed something strange and magnetic. A young woman with a raspy voice draped in bohemian patterns, looking straight into the camera with eyes that refused to bow. Some mocked her, some adored her, but no one ignored her. And, for Cher, that was victory. From that moment, her before fame chapter ended. Cher stepped out of someone else's shadow and into her own light, where her voice was no longer an instrument, but a soul made audible. The scars from her childhood, the hunger, the rejection, all of it fused into the sound that would define her for decades. It was the birth of a woman the world would come to call the goddess of pop. And if anyone asked her what had kept her standing for 6 decades since, Cher would probably smile and repeat the vow she'd made as a child. One day, the whole world will hear me. Now, they finally have.